And we're off. Okay, so growing woodland mushrooms. Today we're going to talk about the basics of inoculating. We'll actually talk about what that means. We'll cover how to grow and harvest mushrooms, and we're really going to be focusing on shiitakes today, although we will touch on a few other mushrooms that you can also grow outside. Growing mushrooms indoor is also an option, but that's for a different day. And you'll see featured here on our cover slide our very fabulous glamour shot of a shiitake log totally covered in mushrooms, sitting right in our stream in the model forest, which you'll see more of shortly. So just a quick run through of all the topics we're going to talk about today. First, I just want to talk a little bit about fungus. That is really the star of the show. So just going to talk a little bit about the organism itself, its role in our environment. And then I will introduce shiitakes, how to identify them, how they really came into cultivation. Next, we will encourage you all just to think of some considerations for yourself as a potential grower and to understand some needs for a mushroom to really grow and really thrive. And then we're gonna get to like the meat and potatoes of the presentation, the shiitake cultivation section. That's kind of our soup to nuts where we're going to spend a lot of our time. And then after we have hopefully given you a pretty good idea of what it looks like to grow mushrooms and how to do it, we're gonna briefly talk about how you could scale your production up, keep it down. Maybe folks are interested in marketing, so we can touch on that stuff there. And then finally, our last bit, we will get to touch on a few other mushrooms that you could consider growing, maybe right alongside your shiitakes. Okay, so fungi or fungus, the organism. A lot of people really refer to mushrooms and think that's the organism, that's the fungus, but the mushroom is actually just the fruiting body of the organism. I always say mushrooms are like apples, and I usually, if I could see your faces, I usually get some funny looks when I say that. But if you think about mushrooms as the fruit, you can really relate them to the fruit on an apple tree, the apple. So the apple tree is that perennial structure. It means it grows all year round. It's always there. You can pick all the apples off the tree and not really damage that tree itself. So fungus is really the same way. It has a perennial structure that grows year round. You just might not be able to see it. And then when the time is right, usually when environmental triggers occur, they'll fruit or produce mushrooms. And so here on this slide, you can see what a regular mushroom looks like. And I say regular because not all mushrooms actually look this way. They take on many different forms, but in most cases, and in the case of a shiitake, you will see them present themselves this way. Oops, let's get back. So we have a cap, and on the underside of the cap is the gill, and that is where the spores or seed-like structures come from. And those spores reproduce asexually. So they come out of that gill, that fruiting body, and they float out into the landscape, and they're looking for a home. So they hope that they'll land with the wind somewhere suitable for them to grow. And their mission is to find another spore and connect and continue to grow a new fungus there. So different mushrooms have different structures under their cap, but as I said, many have gills, shiitakes have gills, so that's what we'll be focusing on today. And then the stalk is like a stem and it holds the cap up. Some mushrooms have this feature here called a ring or an annulus, and in some cases that can be very key for identification. And then underground, mushrooms have these root-like structures, and those are called hyphae, which are individual structures. And so mushrooms are, they're decomposers out in our woods, out in our landscape, And it's just as important as the producers. They break things down and complete that food web, that cycle of nutrients. So they're really quite important, and we like to encourage them in our woodlands. And so thinking about that hyphae, as an individual strand, it's called a hyphae, but as a mass, it's called mycelium. So what you're looking at here is a picture of a jar, and you can see these web-like structures forming inside the jar, and that is the mycelium. This is the shiitake being grown in a jar on sterilized wood chips. And this was, as I said, how I got started growing mushrooms as a class project. So this is my first shiitake culture. And it's pretty fascinating to see that perennial structure that exists year-round, that is the fungus that produces that fruit that we like to eat. And so it's really important for all of us to be able to properly identify a shiitake mushroom if we want to consume them. Luckily, it's really easy, and you'll understand why in just a moment, but in general, the cap is like a light to dark brown color. Sometimes it has some white specks on the edges of it. The gills, that underside of the cap, are white to a very light brown, and the stem is a matching color. And so those spores that we talked about on a shiitake are white. And spores, just as you're kind of out in the woods, are not really visible. They're microscopic structures, but they are often key to differentiating one shiitake from another. So actually, I just wanted to ask, does anyone know what this picture is on the other side of my screen here? It looks like some type of spherical image. I'm trying to pull the chat up here. I don't know why, but I can't see it.
Tracy, we have a couple of people with spore print as their answer.
Thank you, Connor. Yes, it's a spore print. So spore prints, oops, we want to go back. Spore prints are really important to do if you're especially thinking about harvesting or using wild mushrooms. For the shiitake, it's maybe just a fun little project. So you can actually take a mushroom cap and place it on a piece of paper with the stem cut off. And many people will use like half black, half white, because you don't know what color the spores are going to be maybe when you start. And you can set a bowl on top of that cap and leave it undisturbed, maybe overnight. Come back to it the next day, take the bowl off, pick the mushroom cap up, and oftentimes you're presented with this beautiful print of the spores. So what happens overnight is the spores are falling out of those gills, dropping onto that piece of paper, and they accumulate in this large mass, and they'll leave the color of their spores, so you don't need a microscope to even see them. So it's a fun little thing to do with mushrooms, and it can be really key to differentiating shiitakes from another type of mushroom we'll be talking about in just a second. Habitat is equally important to consider when thinking about mushroom identification. And what's great about shiitakes is that they don't grow wild here. There has never been a single occurrence of a shiitake found wild in our landscape. So you will only find them growing on those logs that you're intentionally cultivating them from. So that makes it a pretty sure thing that you know what you have, but I'd still encourage you all just to do a spore print just for fun. And so maybe equally as important as being able to identify the mushrooms you're going to consume is being able to identify their lookalikes, especially if some happen to be poisonous, like this one. This is a galerina. This does grow wild in our landscape, and it grows on dead, downed wood. It's a little bit of a different looking mushroom from shiitakes. It has a darker underside. The gills and the stems are always darker, and the spores are like a rusty brown color. And so the only time you might risk finding this on your shiitake log is if it's very old. If the log has aged out and it's not really producing anymore. Some people like to kind of throw it off to the side, and every once in a while it'll fruit some shiitakes. That's when it's really important just to take a second look and make sure you have what it is you're looking for. Okay, so I mentioned that shiitakes don't grow here in our woods. They're actually native to Asia and Japan, China, and Korea. And the word shiitake, shi means tree and taki means mushroom. Shiitake literally translates to a tree mushroom. And it has actually been cultivated for well over 1,000 years. The system that we're going to be talking about today, the method to grow them, was developed in Japan in the early 1900s. And you can see a picture of what a farm in Japan looks like with a massive amount of logs. This is a pretty large scale operation. And so shiitakes are what's called like a weak pathogen. So they don't do well with competition. And that is why the techniques that we'll be presenting were developed to give them what's called a competitive edge, to let them be the first decomposers to get to that log and to be able to take hold before anything else comes in. And the other term you see here is a saprophyte. So a saprophyte means that this mushroom grows on only dead wood. Some mushrooms are parasitic. They'll grow on living trees and eventually kill them. Other mushrooms form symbiotic relationships with living organisms where it's a mutual nutrient and water sharing. So as I said, these ones are saprophytes, and they just like to colonize that dead stuff and do that nutrient cycling. And so I'm sure many of you are familiar with growing plants, but maybe mushrooms is a whole new topic for you. So mushrooms do have somewhat similar needs to plants and humans or animals, but slightly different in a few ways. So we're hoping to give you a pretty good understanding of what they really need to grow. So the first thing that we all need is food. Shiitakes and many other mushrooms can consume pieces of wood. So there's really two different main classes. There's what's called the brown rot and the white rot. So the brown rot mushrooms consume all the cellulose in a log or a piece of wood, leaving all the lignin, which has a brown color. So brown rot makes wood stay looking brown. And then there's also a category called the white rot. So those white rot mushrooms consume lignin, leaving the cellulose and creating like a really light, sort of punky, white colored wood. And shiitakes are a white rot mushroom, so they consume that lignin in the wood. And then, the mushrooms, the fruiting bodies are really mostly water. I think it's over 90% of their composition is water. So they, of course, need a lot of that to grow. And we'll talk about how to manage that and how to give them the right amount of moisture so they thrive. Fungus also need air exchange. They are just like us in the fact that they take in oxygen and exude carbon dioxide. So they do need some good airflow all around them. And when the mushrooms do start growing from the fungus, they really do need light. If you've ever grown shiitakes or seen them growing, or hopefully you will in the future, you'll notice that they are oriented towards wherever the light is coming from. So that is a key for them, but not too much, and we'll talk about that too. So just like anything else that you're growing, you do have to take care to protect it from anything that might negatively impact its growth. So it needs light, but not direct sunlight. So it needs to be in the shade. Those mushrooms need protection from wind and protection from any pests or predators. And we'll talk about those as we move along as well. And then so, while we're mainly thinking about growing this crop or, producing these mushrooms, I think it's important for ourselves as the grower to perhaps reflect a little bit and ask ourselves, why do we want to grow mushrooms? And at this time, I would encourage you all to, post in the chat. I think a few of you did as you got started about, why you were here today. But I'd love to hear from you all about what might have triggered you to want to grow mushrooms. And I think, there's a few obvious reasons, but there's a whole range of reasons that I think people get interested, especially in a wooded setting. So as I'm giving you a moment to post those thoughts, I'll just address the next question here that maybe we can reflect on a little bit towards the end of the presentation. So, what resources do you have or do you need to grow mushrooms? What is your spot like? What are your woodlands like? And as we go through the process, it'll become more apparent like what the key features are that we're looking for here. So it's just, something to keep in the back of your mind that maybe we can come back to at the end. And I think, something that you'll all see as we go throughout this process is there's a lot of room for variation and innovation. So just kind of thinking about like what's unique to your spot or what's unique to you. With your skill sets, you can perhaps look for ways to apply that and do something totally different and find success in a new way. So Connor, are we seeing any folks share about why they might want to grow mushrooms?
Absolutely, yeah.
Great.
One participant talks about incorporating them into a permaculture and self-sufficient gardening plan, which is great.
Fantastic.
Just further knowledge, both as a master gardener and want to learn and learn, which I totally relate to from Danielle. Dietary helps eliminate toxins from the body. Small scale woodland owners, gardening and wants to, expand. They're delicious and enjoy eating mushrooms to go along with gardening and beekeeping.
Oh.
Which all seems very relatable
Yeah, thanks for sharing all that. That's a really nice range of reasons for people to want to grow mushrooms. I think, at the bottom line, it's really because we want the food, right? But there's so much more to it. So we can jump right into those details. So just like at the basic view of how to grow mushrooms, I just wanted to present this very minimalist process that we're going to be picking apart and sort of dissecting. So it all starts with getting some wood, using trees to create what's called a bolt, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then step 2 is inoculating that bolt, introducing that mushroom to the log and creating the right circumstances for it to grow. Step 3 is maybe the hardest for us all. It's the waiting period, letting that mushroom, that fungus colonize that log. And then after that process is done, you move to step 4, which is what's called shocking a bolt. That is shifting environmental conditions to trigger those fungus to produce fruit. And then, of course, after that happens, you can harvest your fruit and enjoy them and go back to that incubation period, or some folks might want to move on to this other step of processing for sale. So at the very basis assessment, this is what it looks like to grow mushrooms. We are going to spend a lot of time on the first 2 steps, sourcing those materials and inoculating those bolts. So let's dive right in. So getting wood to grow mushrooms on can often be a pretty big stumbling block for people, especially if maybe you don't own your own woods, or maybe you don't have the ability to cut them down, or maybe even if you do have the ability to cut them down, you might be interested in buying them from somewhere else, maybe another landowner, a firewood producer. So there's like a few different ways you can think about obtaining that wood. And so what we're looking for is pole-sized hardwoods. The best preferred species are oak, and I wrote maple here, but I mean particularly sugar maple. Red maple is not really a great hardwood, it's a great tree, but not necessarily super ideal for growing shiitakes. What's called like the tier 2 species of wood that you might want to use are beech or your hornbeams, hop hornbeam or just hornbeam. And then some folks actually do grow shiitakes on birch, which I can't really speak to, and I think they're categorized as a tier 3. So we're mainly looking for oaks, sugar maples, and those tier 2 are pretty productive. The beech, I grow a lot of my shiitakes on ironwood or hop hornbeam, or there's a lot of different common names for that species. And so as I said, we're looking for pole size hardwood, and we'll talk about why the size matters in a little bit, but it's mainly for management. So one can pick up the log and move it around, and you're not trying to lift like a huge tree trunk. And so what we do here, and what we would encourage other woodland stewards or owners to do, is to think about obtaining that pole-size wood through sustainable management practices, such as a timber stand improvement. So this picture here demonstrates one tree that's cut next to another tree that's quite large. So that smaller pole-sized tree that we decided to cut was really in direct competition with this larger tree. And that larger tree was more established. And I'm sure if we looked up, we would see that that tree dominated the canopy and maybe caused some reduced light to this smaller pole-sized tree. So that decision was made to take a tree that was in direct competition with another one that we really valued or really maybe wanted to keep there. And so people engage in timber stand improvement practices all the time, independent from reasons for growing mushrooms, but it's a great way to source what might seem like a byproduct of another activity and repurpose it for something that will give something back to you. And so the time of the year the wood is harvested is perceived to be really important. But I wanted to highlight just some research that was done through Cornell that showed that yes, maybe there's a really ideal time of year to harvest that wood, but all in all, any time of year is a good time of year to harvest shiitake bolts and inoculate. So we can see here that logs that were harvested in the winter were the most productive, and that's what we've seen time and time again. We don't really have a lot of nutrients running through the wood, so the bark is nice and tight, which is important for a log to have really good, strong bark on it, functioning as like a skin. And other fungus isn't really active in the winter. So when the log is cut in the winter, it reduces the potential of exposing it to other competing fungus. As you can see, spring is quite productive as well. That's another really popular time. I think people are just kind of itching to get out of the woods. So that's when we see most inoculations occur. And that's actually when we do most of ours here at the Agroforestry Center. But summer and fall aren't too far behind. So if you're like really feeling like you want to do it now or later in the season, I think you should go right ahead. You're not going to see much of a difference. And I will just note that this research, along with a few other photos that I've received permission to utilize, are from this really fantastic guide. And I will share a link at the end of the presentation, and we can get a PDF out to you all as well if you're interested. It was a guide that was developed by the University of Vermont in partnership with New York and Cornell Cooperative Extension that developed best management practices for growing shiitakes on logs. And it was done with a group of people who were brand new to growing mushrooms, maybe about 40 different growers, and it tracked all of their time and all their expenses. So it created this publication that really helps you learn from other people's mistakes. And it will show you exactly how much time you should expect to spend on a certain component of mushroom production, and also give you a really good estimate on how much money you might spend or how much money you don't want to spend. So I'll be referencing that just a few times, and I just wanted to let folks know about that document that we'll be sharing at the end. Okay, so back to wood. So a lot of people who do own their own woods may or may not have experience with a chainsaw, and this can be, from looking at that data, we found this is like really one of the biggest time sinks. If a grower who maybe isn't super proficient with a chainsaw decides that they want to go out and fell their own bolts and source those themselves, you might be spending a lot of time doing that with trees getting hung up or chainsaw maintenance issues. So some people are all for it, and that's great, but some people really don't want to go down that road. So if you don't want to be sourcing your own wood with your own chainsaw, you can look elsewhere. So the wood can be sourced or bought from other woodland owners. We see a lot of people who do what's called like salvaging. If they know about a timber harvest that occurred, that pole-sized wood is just kind of getting left there in a lot of cases. And so when you're working with another landowner or maybe a firewood producer, there are a lot of different features that we're looking for in this wood as compared to something that you would be burning. So it could be a steep learning curve, but luckily Cornell Small Farms put together this fantastic publication about buying and selling bolts. So it outlines a lot of the specifications that you're looking for, the things that might be unique to harvesting this as opposed to another type of wood. And it even has some suggested prices there. I don't know if you can see that, but it's looking like estimates were about 50 cents per bolt from a salvage, $1 a bolt if the log is harvested by someone and picked up by you, or maybe $2 to $3 a bolt if you're buying those logs and having them be delivered. And that was kind of based off of firewood prices. I think those numbers could still use a little bit of work, because what we've found is that great care needs to be taken when moving the wood so the bark isn't damaged. As I said, it functions as a skin, and if it's damaged, then the mushroom will be not only exposed to other competition, but risks the potential to dry out too much and not grow very well. And so I have the link down here at the bottom of the screen, but I also have the link at the resources page at the end. And so I keep using this word bolt. When a log is cut up for mushroom production, it just magically becomes a bolt. So a bolt and a log could be used interchangeably, but ultimately a bolt is a specific dimension for growing. So typically they're 4 to 6 inches in diameter around, and about 3 to 4 feet in length. And you can have a lot of variability with those dimensions, but ultimately this size will create something that's manageable for a grower to pick up and move. As we move on, you'll find that growing shiitakes on logs is really about just farming the wood around. So you want something that's comfortable for you to pick up, so you're not going to be breaking your back, especially when it's completely saturated. And this also gives the fungus the right amount of food, and that diameter keeps the log hydrated. So if you go smaller than this, smaller than the 4-inch diameter, you'll find that your logs might be drying out a lot quicker. And so you'll have to manage them more, and it kind of creates more work for you. So I just have a couple of pictures here of what some of this pole-sized hardwood looks like. I would say those pictures of us cutting those wood up is maybe a little on the small side. But since we source from timber stand improvements, we'll take what we can get. And then the other picture here of all the wood stacked, that was actually salvaged from a utility line that ran through a woodland owner's property. And those trees were cut on the edges of the utility line to manage the wires, the power lines. And they show a really important feature here that it's really easy to forget about. So if you look at the ends of these logs that are facing us, the ones on the bottom of the pallet here, you can see these variations in color. And this is what's called sapwood to heartwood ratio. So on the outer edge of this piece of wood is the active growing area. It's where that sapwood is, that's where nutrients are moved, that's where cell division occurs. It's like where the xylem cells are. And that is where a lot of the food is for the mushroom. And then on the inner part of the log is the heartwood, which is not very active and is not what these shiitakes are going to be consuming. So when we're sourcing our wood from maybe a timber stand improvement, many of us are getting pieces of wood that didn't get a lot of light, and they might not have a ton of that sapwood. And so we found that production is pretty good from those logs, but it's just immensely better if you can find wood that was growing in more direct light. So this was just a win-win for everyone. The utility companies were cutting these wood down. The landowner wanted to use it, so we were able to salvage this wood for free and utilize it for growing our mushrooms, and it just had a fantastic amount of sapwood. So now that we've talked about where you can get your wood, now you'll need to get your spawn. So spawn is just a word for that shiitake mycelium grown out on sterilized sawdust. I actually have a little bit with me. I can show you. Somehow every season, I always have some shiitake spawn lingering in the fridge. So companies produce this. You can make it your own. We're not really going to get into that yet. So this is a clump of sawdust that's all fused together with mycelium. And this has been left alone, and mushrooms are actually starting to grow. So they're forming these masses. So if I broke this apart, it just easily breaks up. And this is what's used to introduce to the wood that we just talked about.
Hey, Tracy, you're still on screen share right now. Do you want to turn that off for a moment just so you can give everyone a bigger picture?
I will show it again at the end.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I'll hold on to it for later. I'll resist my urge to have props in my hand. It's just like second nature when I'm presenting. So that spawn, as I said, you can make it yourself, but it's a little bit of a complex process, and it's difficult to get really like vigorous and viable spawn. So most people source it from other companies, and I featured just a few logos from other companies that are pretty well known and widely used. Field and Forest is a company out of Wisconsin. Fungi Ally is one out of Massachusetts. Smugtown Mushroom is from Central New York. And then Mushroom Mountain is from North Carolina. And for me, I think the take home is that spawn producers create really awesome logos. So I just really love those images of all those mushrooms. And so you can look to any of these spawn producers or any other ones and get your product. And they're in two main categories. So you can get sawdust spawn that I was describing, or you can also get plug spawn. And plug spawn is the same process of having a sterilized media, but it's on wooden dowels, and the mycelium will colonize that dowel, and you can use that to inoculate. And I don't have much experience using that one. It's a bit more expensive, but I guess it's better suited for folks who are maybe only interested in doing 1 or 2 logs, because you don't really need a specific tool to get the spawn in the hole of the log. You just need a hammer to kind of pop it in. So we'll be talking mostly about sawdust spawn. And when you're thinking about growing shiitakes, there's actually like a wide variety of strains that you can use. And they fall in these different categories based on what temperature they need to fruit. So most producers, including us here, we use wide range spawn. And so those wide range shiitake spawns will grow when temperatures are on average about 70 degrees. They'll start fruiting in May and go through September, maybe into October, so the better part of our growing season. Warm weather strains produce in maybe the peak of summer when temperatures get really, really hot. And I have heard that more growers are looking to warm weather strains because of the increased temperatures we've been seeing here in the Northeast. Wide range have always performed well, but when we get into the middle of summer and it's like consistently staying in the 90s, or I guess that was last week for many of us, those wide range spawn don't perform very well. So the warm weather, that really hot conditions in the middle of summer can fill that gap. And then the other one that I'm a big fan of, and I have a lot of experience growing, are the cold weather strains. So these perform really well in the shoulder seasons, and they will produce on their own spontaneously when the weather shifts in the spring, from winter to spring, and again in the fall when we are leaving summer and the temperatures are dropping and we're moving into a colder period. This is great for producers who are thinking about marketing and really want to have some season extension, as they'll grow well before and well after those typical wide range strains. And the other nice thing about them is they're a great way to use maybe some of that larger diameter wood. As I mentioned, we want to have bolts that we can pick up and move around, because many of us will be using those wide range strains and they require some management that we'll talk about. But the cold weather, you just leave them be and you don't have to move them around once they're set. So if you have some larger wood, maybe from the base of a tree, it's a great way to put that to use and get some additional mushrooms either first thing in the spring or later on in the season. And so once you have your spawn and your wood, you'll need a few other tools or materials, and pretty much all of that stuff can be sourced from these spawn suppliers that we talked about. Many of them you might have laying around, but wax is something else that I just wanted to highlight. As I mentioned, the skin on your log is really important to retain moisture. And when we're inoculating, we're putting holes in that log to introduce the spawn. And so we need to seal that back up so one, critters don't come along and eat all of that spawn with that really nutritious mycelium that they're going to be after. And two, so the log can retain moisture and hold on to all that it has. And so wax is really important, and I would encourage you all to get food grade wax. It can be tempting to, just maybe go to a craft supply store and get some, candle making wax or something, but the mushrooms will be in contact with the wax. So food grade wax is really recommended. And as I said, you can get that from all of those different spawn suppliers. Okay, so now we're going to move into the process of taking all that stuff, all your wood and your spawn, and introducing it into the log. So again, I just wanted to give you a really quick overview of the process before we dive in. This is what a shiitake or an inoculation workshop might look like. So you can see kind of these three distinct stages of the process. The first one is creating those holes in your wood. The second stage is using a tool called an inoculator to put that spawn in the hole. And then the third and final step is heating up that wax and sealing the log up. So we're going to dive into what that really means. So as I mentioned, you can use the sawdust or the wooden dowels. Here in the bottom of the screen, you can see a picture. It's a bowl filled with that spawn. It might just look like wood chips, but believe me, there's little threads of white mycelium all over those sterilized sawdust. And in that bowl, you can see the tool called the inoculator, and that's what we'll use to put the spawn in the hole. And then I also have a note here about using a drill or an angle grinder. An angle grinder has a lot more power to it, and it can be pretty easily modified to create or to attach a drill bit that will create these holes. And so you can see in the picture there, the woman drilling the holes in her log, she has an angle grinder in her hand, and there's a drill on the table. So I think that might say a little bit about which tool is better than the other. And when I started, I only used a drill. I wasn't really aware of this angle grinder adaption. And it is a lot of work with the drill. I mean, you're like pushing and pulling. And then once you get an angle grinder in your hand, it's like you don't have to do any work. A lot of the drill bit attachments have like a screw tip on it. So it really just sucks it right in with minimal effort and great speed. And so you will need something to apply the wax to the hole once you've drilled it, filled it with spawn. I have a quick video we'll see in just a minute, but we usually just use a hot plate and then set a pan in the hot plate with the wax in it. And it's important to keep a close eye on that wax. There's a very fine line between smoking and ignition. So if you're heating up your wax and it's melted, keep your heat source really low, or maybe even intermittently turn it off. And when you notice the wax starting to smoke, that's when you might want to pick that pan up out of the hot plate and just remove it from the heat source, just to be as safe as possible. And speaking of safety, other safety equipment is really encouraged, especially when you're using that angle grinder. Pieces of wood are going to be flying all over the place, and it's quite loud as it's a higher powered piece of equipment. So we do recommend safety glasses and ear protection when you're doing this process. You can see here in the picture, someone is putting in the holes while another person is holding, which just makes it run a little more smoothly so your log isn't rolling away from you. And you know, both of those people should be wearing that safety equipment just to keep everybody safe. And so I just wanted to show, if you were here, if we did have this in person, this is what our Shiitake inoculation setup generally looks like when we are having folks here come do some logs. So you can see our angle grinder right up front, then moving on to the spawn with the wax and the hot plate down at the end. And I'm going to show you a quick video of what that process looks like. But I've been mentioning a little bit about the drill bit. I just wanted to talk about some specifics on that hole sizes that you're putting in, because it's pretty important for both introducing enough spawn for your inoculation to be successful, and then to make sure you're not just like pouring way too much spawn into the log, because it can be really a waste of money. It's unnecessary to have more than a certain amount. So that drill bit is going to be like about 12 to 12.5 millimeters, and that size will align to the inoculation tool quite well. And I think that translates into like a 7/16 drill bit. And many spawn suppliers will sell these along with the adapter that attaches it to the angle grinder. And the drill bit not only is the right size to create the right width of the hole, but it also has a stopper. So it'll only go in a certain depth that also matches the amount of spawn that will go in from the inoculation tool. And that's pretty important because we want to reduce the amount of air spaces left in that hole. So the width and the depth should really match the tool that you're using to introduce that spawn. And so when we're putting holes in our logs, we're creating this grid-like pattern. So we're doing a row, and then we're turning the log a little bit, and we're creating another row that's slightly offset from that first one. So it'll create a grid or a diamond-like pattern. And those holes can be, I wrote 4 to 6 inches, but it could be really 3 to 6 inches apart. And the rows are about 2 to 5 inches apart. And a general rule for that is you should have as many rows as you do inches of diameter. So if you have a bolt that has a 4-inch diameter, you should wind up with about 4 rows of holes on your log. And so I'm going to play this video, and I did leave the sound in here because I talked through it, but I apologize for kind of the background noise. We do have a highly trafficked road that runs by the office, but you can get the gist of the process and hear a little bit about what I'm doing.
Hey, Tracy, I don't think there's any sound coming in for us.
Oh, okay. Well, that's even better. I guess I should just be explaining what's happening.
You might need to start that one again. Yeah.
Okay, we'll start it over. Good to know, and it's actually better because the traffic is quite loud in the back. So here I am holding the angle grinder. I've got my safety glasses on. I don't have my ear protection on there for that one. And I am explaining that I'm going to put the holes in about 4 inches apart, move down and grab that spawn, and then finish off with the wax on the end there. So some people will actually put like a ruler or something down on the table, or you can just eyeball it. If you do a couple logs, you get a good feel for it, and it's not rocket science. It doesn't have to be totally specific, but it can be helpful to have that framework. And I'm kind of joking about that in the video there, that my holes, I'm sure, are not evenly spaced. And so I'm taking that tool, and I just did a quick 1-2 into the spawn, put it over the hole, and give it a little pop. And then I take my finger and press down to make sure there's no air pockets. As I mentioned before, that's kind of like a killer. And there is our wax setup, all melted, with a little wax dabber that you can also get from a spawn supplier. And you just want to make sure that that wax fully covers the hole and has a little bit of a seal on the wood as well. Once you get going, it can be really easy to have some little gaps in your wax, and it's like the rodents can smell that stuff from a mile away. They come all over for your mycelium, so it's important to have that wax fully cover the hole. Okay, so we just covered a lot. We talked all about fungus, and we talked about where we get our wood from and our spawn and that inoculation process. So now I thought would be a good time, and I think we're right at about the hour mark, where we can break and field any questions that folks might have. I'm gonna just stop sharing my screen for a minute, and we can go back. Sorry about that with the no sound. So if anyone has any questions that they would like to ask, you can raise your hand or just post the questions in the holes. And I see someone asked how deep the holes are. They're about 1 inch deep. And now that I'm in this view, I can show I have this angle grinder here. And so this is the attachment to make the angle grinder receive the drill bit. And then the drill bit has a screw on it and this stopper right here. So it's about 1 inch of depth. And I also have this inoculator tool, which is really just like a glorified plunger. And you can see this piece comes out and retracts. And there's actually a line on it to about where it retracts from. And so this is what sucks up that spawn and we'll align it to the depth of that drill bit. I see someone ask, is it possible to put too much wax on? No, it is not. But in fact, wax is the most expensive component of inoculating. I can tell you what the price is right off the top of my head, but it does really amount to quite a cost. So when folks around here started growing shiitakes on wood, people would actually wax the ends of the logs to reduce that moisture loss. And there was a bunch of side-by-side trials that occurred mainly out of Cornell University. And they found that it made no difference with production. So people stopped waxing the ends and saved a ton of money by doing that. But if you do have any defects in your bark, like maybe if it was scraped off somewhere or you had a limb that you cut off, I would encourage you to just put some wax on those pieces. So no, you really can't put too much wax on. And then I see that somebody asked that they noticed I don't have anyone holding the log when I drilled. I just happened to find a really well-balanced log for that one. And it didn't roll on me, but there's 2 tips that I found that are really helpful. In my at-home inoculation process, I use pallets, and I put a wooden pallet on top of a table, and that has those sections or panels of wood across that are really quite nice for holding the log in between. So it really stops it from rolling, and it creates like these 2 workstations, one across from another, so you can actually have a nice little inoculation party going on there. And something else that works really well in a pinch are just like rocks, little pebbles. So when you put your log on the table, you can just grab a rock and kind of wedge it under whichever end it's rolling towards, and that'll stop it immediately. I see Danielle asked about rodents. As long as you seal up those holes good, they don't really seem to come for the wax. We do see them coming for the mycelium, but to date, I haven't heard of anyone finding rodents that are just eating the wax, although I'm not sure how you would tell the difference between whether or not they're coming for the wax or the mycelium, because they'll probably eat both while they're there. But you know, I've talked to a lot of growers, and I haven't heard of anyone having like mass failure because rodents came and ate all of the wax and mycelium. Maybe they would nibble on a couple holes or something. Somebody asked about whether or not the logs should be freshly cut or if they can be used from a year or 2 ago. That is a really important question. The logs need to be freshly cut. As I mentioned, shiitakes do not do well with competition. So those logs that are cut should be inoculated within a few weeks of felling. You can probably get away with a month, but I wouldn't push it because you'll be kind of seeing that perhaps failure way later on, and it's a real bummer if you do this and wait, and then your shiitakes aren't really producing very well, and you might not be exactly sure why, and that could be a factor. For a long period of time, folks thought that the trees needed to be felled, and then you would have to wait a few days because living trees have these antifungal defense systems. So a lot of growers thought that the wood would have to be felled, and then you would wait a few days, maybe a week, for those defense systems to die off. But there were, again, some more trials that were done that found that the logs could be, the tree could be felled, the logs could be cut up and inoculated all on the same day with great success when the fruiting occurs. So the fresher, the better. And that might have something to do with why logs cut in the winter have that higher production rate. As I mentioned, other competing fungus are not active in the winter. So cutting in the winter actually buys you a lot more time. If you cut a tree down in the winter, leave it fully intact, you could comfortably go even up to maybe even 2 months before you buck it up into bolts and then inoculate it. With the temperatures below freezing, you're not going to be getting competition, and with the tree left totally intact, it's going to be holding most of its moisture. I see someone asking about equipment costs. Gosh, I've had my inoculator for so long. I think the inoculator costs about I want to say about 30 bucks. I'm going to send around that PDF. I have the link at the end that breaks down the cost for everything. And you could visit, any one of those spawn suppliers and see what everything costs. But, all told, with maybe if you're doing like 20 logs or so, you could get some spawn, wax, have your grinder attachment, your inoculator tool, maybe for about $100 or so. And so this tool and your bit, if you take care of that stuff, like any tool, you can keep using it, year after year after year. Logs covered with lichen, don't worry about it. Anything that's growing on the surface of a log isn't really going to impact your shiitake production. I was going to mention that later, but you want to always be on the lookout for pests or any pressures on your log, and we'll be looking for competing fungus, but anything that's superficial, just on the bark, it's really not an issue. Do the sources cut and send or make available pickup bolts the same day? So someone's asking about getting the bolts cut and picking up in the same day. And that's going to be a relationship that you're going to have to build with your supplier. So finding a woodland donor or finding someone who sells firewood, it takes a lot of communication to build a relationship to kind of get the material that you want in an efficient amount of time. So like a great example is people who are harvesting firewood, they might be skidding or attaching those trees to a piece of equipment and dragging them out of the woods, and they'll come out all kind of dinged up with a lot of dirt on them, or maybe they dragged across rocks, and unfortunately that stuff can't really be used. So it does take a lot of communication and a little bit of work. And one of the links I'll send out that will bring you to that fact sheet on how to source your own bolts. It'll also bring you to the website that has a mapping tool. And the mapping tool is for anyone either looking to sell or looking to buy bolts. So you can put yourself on the map and say, hi, I'm so-and-so, I'm in this area and I'm selling shiitake bolts, or hi, I'm so-and-so and I'm here and I want to buy them. So that can be a great way to make that connection and then begin that process of communicating and developing a good relationship with your supplier. How early in the season can inoculation happen? You could do it in the winter. The logs are going to kind of sit dormant and they won't really be active. Most folks will wait until like early spring when the temperatures are starting to rise a little bit. So as soon as you put that spawn in that log, it's like beginning the colonization process. If you do it too early, like in the dead of winter, you might risk that moisture loss or that desiccation of your spawn. So a lot of people will maybe start inoculating around the time when the tapping season begins. I know a lot of folks who are maple producers and shiitake growers because they're very complementary. So as people are boiling down their sap, they're also inoculating their logs, or I guess April in general is another really popular time to inoculate. Someone's starting to ask a little bit about harvesting. We're going to talk about that in our next few slides. Connor, did I miss anything else that's not really related to the next phase of production?
Yeah, there were a couple earlier on. One of them was, what is a great way to stabilize a spore print so you can preserve it and maybe hang it on your wall?
Oh, that's a great idea. I mean, I would assume just some like some poly or like a adhesive spray or something like that. Really make some nice artwork out of those beautiful spore prints.
Yeah, I've seen art spray or even hairspray.
Oh, yeah.
It's helpful on construction sites as well when you use a rope dust, for snapping lines, I imagine that would work as well, although I've never done it with a spore print.
Yeah, or maybe most simply, if you just put it in a frame, it should remain.
All right. There was a couple other great comments, questions about the research, and it sounds like that will be sent out to everyone related to the UVM SARE project.
Yes, that was like my most reliable document when I got started, so I would encourage everyone to take a look when we send those out.
And then the only other thing before you move on was Devin had a quick announcement on the sign-up process for In These Woods.
Yeah, Tracy mentioned that in the beginning that you to just mention in the chat if you want to sign up, but actually you do have to use the link that I am about to send out again. And please fill that out. You can ask for a paper copy in that, and we also don't have your emails through Zoom, so we do need you to fill out the information there.
Oh, thank you, Devin.
Oh.
And I guess while we're in this mode, before I go back to sharing my screen, I just wanted to show you that sawdust spawn again. So it's kind of in a mass here because the mycelium has really fused it together. But you can see on the edges that mycelium will form like this skin, and shiitakes are actually starting to grow from my refrigerator. And this really just breaks right up. So it comes in a plastic bag with like a breathable filter. Like I said, fungus need air exchange even when they're in this perennial state. So when you get your spawn, if you order some, it's encouraged to massage it. When it forms this mass, it kind of becomes lazy. The mycelium thinks that it has colonized all of its food, and then it kind of sits put until it wants to start producing fruit like this one has. So if you keep it in the bag until you're ready to use it, and kind of, I just have a reusable bag here, but you would just kind of like, massage and break that up, especially if you're not using it right away. The spawn should be used within about a month of receiving it. And if you're leaving it that long, maybe once a week or so, just take it out of the fridge because it does need to be stored in the refrigerator or else it'll get quite funky. So take it out of the fridge maybe once a week and just kind of break it up, shake it around, stick it back in until you're ready to use it. And if you have gone too long without using your spawn, you will know it. Other competing fungus find their way in that bag somehow, and it'll get even funkier than it's intended to be. So I think if everyone's ready, we can move on to our next steps of getting those mushrooms to pop. All right. Okay, so once you inoculate those logs, they need a home. They need somewhere to live and stay for their entire life, which can be upwards of 4 years. And they need to have all of those considerations that we talked about at the beginning provided for them to be successful. So the place where they are kept is called a laying yard. It's where you lay your logs and that spawn colonizes them. And that process takes about a year. It's really 6 months, but because of our winter, that dormant season, it amounts to about a year. So if you inoculated your bolts today, then next year in June or July, you would be able to start fruiting those, or you would see some mushrooms coming off. So wherever you keep them, you're going to need to have a few things. You're going to need to have a water source because that is how we trigger the mushrooms to fruit. And you're going to need to have year-round shade. You will also need to protect those from wind, pests, and predators. And so while we're mainly talking about growing shiitakes in the canopy of a forest, I just wanted to show this image as an example for folks who might not have trees to shade their mushrooms. Or maybe you have trees, but they don't give shade all year round. So ideally, you would be looking for conifers, something with needles that hold on to them all year round, like pines or hemlocks. And you could put your logs under those. They would get shade all year round and would retain the right amount of moisture. So here in this setup, we have an agricultural shade cloth that's erected over those bolts in the laying yard. It would be encouraged to use a shade cloth, even if you're growing in the forest, if you're under deciduous trees or trees that lose their leaves, like maples or oaks. So just a few things to think about. And if you're growing 1 or 2 bolts, you can get away with kind of like tucking them under the porch or keeping them under a shrub, because you can kind of keep a good eye on them and you can move them to water. But if you're growing like a handful or maybe enough to stack on a pallet, you want to think about and create a permanent location for those. So here I wanted to show you what it would look like if you were here in our model forest. We have our very own laying yard, and I'll just play this video knowing that you don't have any sound. You don't need it anyway. So Devin flew our drone to make it look like you are crossing the stream, stepping over onto the road, and moving into our laying yard. And as you're viewing this, you can think about qualities that might make this a good or a bad location. So we're seeing some types of trees as we move in here, and they shift a little bit. My favorite part of the video is how the drone stops right here on some cobwebs, because that is what happens to me every single time I go into the laying yard. Some spiders have been busy at work and I destroy all of their work with my face. So that is like a true experience of what it's like to step into the laying yard. And I'm just gonna play it again, thinking about those qualities. So here you can see we have our stream, what we call the sawmill. So that is our water source. And then if you notice kind of behind the laying yard, there's this slope, this hill that makes it a really nicely protected location. And because of that hill and because of the stream, it holds a lot of moisture and doesn't get a lot of wind, which is really quite perfect. And as we move past some of these deciduous trees, you can see some of the stacks here that kind of keep going in a long row. And those are under the shade of hemlock trees. And so like a totally ideal location for a laying yard would to be under a stand of hemlock trees along a stream side. So we really feel quite lucky to have a location like this right here in our model forest. And so you can choose how you want to organize your bolts. This image, the colored image here, shows them in what's called a crib stack. And that is like the most common way that people store their wood when they're waiting for it to fruit, like in between all of those fruitings. And so you'll notice that they are spaced apart in a row, and then you rotate the way you're stacking them, like you can see here in the picture. And that's really important for that airflow that we talked about at the beginning. Do not stack your bolts like firewood. If it's all kind of tightly, neatly stacked, they'll all kind of fuse together. Eventually the mycelium will die because it can't breathe, and then your bark will rip when you go to pull them apart. And if you can't tell, I'm speaking from experience. So learn from me and don't stack them that way. The crib stacking is great. Height is a consideration. If you don't have a really protected site, or if you don't have high moisture, you want to keep your stacks relatively low. The higher you get, the more vulnerable they are to that wind flow and to that desiccation. And the other image here shows a hillside method, and this is more of the traditional stacking methods used in Asian cultures. I haven't really seen much of this, but you can really find innovative ways to stack your logs. And so as you might imagine, picking mushrooms off of these crib stacks aren't that easy. So the mushrooms do have to be manually moved to force them to fruit and then leaned up somewhere for when that fruiting occurs. So this is where you can start to look for innovation, or depending on what kind of resources you have, you can really modify this to your liking. And so while you're putting your logs to bed, kind of laying them down for that year of waiting period, you can start to think about what your fruiting process might look like. So here's another picture. This is my shiitake laying yard at home, where I also have those crib stacks. And you can see in the background there, there's some logs leaning up. So those are the ones that are starting to fruit, and I'll leave them there for the fruiting, and then I'll lay them back down and crib stack them again for that resting period. And so each log after that year of spawn run, it will start producing, and you can really create the conditions for that log to fruit every 7 weeks. And it will continue to do that year after year for upwards of 4 years. And that, that lifespan on that log is really dependent on the care, really the moisture and the reduction of direct sunlight. So those are all things to keep in mind when you are setting up your laying yard and thinking about fruiting. So here we can see I have a like a feed trough or a water trough, and that is one of my containers for holding water, but there's a few different ways, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So these are just a few different examples of what a fruiting setup might look like. In the center here, this is from the model forest over in Putnam County. They also have a shiitake laying yard, and this is kind of like going all out here. They set up a piece of wood and they attached it to some trees on either end. They put gravel down to reduce infiltration from some pests that we'll talk about. And then they lean their logs up here to fruit before laying them back down. Over on the right side of the screen here, we just have some rope that is tied between some trees to lean them against. Over on the other side, we have a really informal setup of just using a pine tree. And this is also in my laying yard. And I want to say, I think I have 10 logs all the way around that pine tree. And then this lower picture, we have logs leaning against welded wire fence. Some people just use a single strand of wire between 2 trees. Anything just to prop it up, because mushrooms are going to grow all around that log. And if you're really leaning it against another surface, you'll reduce the amount of mushrooms that you're going to get. We don't want to do that. And so here's a couple close-up shots of ends of a bolt or crib stacks. And this is here in our model forest. And you can actually see this white stuff on the end of all the bolts here. And that is the mycelium colonizing during the spawn run. And these bolts are just over a year old. And this is prior to our first fruiting of the year. And you can actually see some cracks here. That's not too bad, but for me, that's a little bit of a red flag that says, like, whoops, like moisture content is dropping on these logs, and I need to manage them to improve it. And then the other logs that we have in the neighboring photo, these are from 2016. you can see remnants of where that mycelium was really, really visible. And these logs from 2016 are actually still pretty productive. And so each time you shock a log or a bolt, on average, throughout the length of its life, you will get about 1/4 to 1/2 pound of shiitakes per log per fruiting. And as I said, it's an average over their entire life. For your first fruiting, your first year, maybe even your first second year, you might get a whole lot more than that per fruiting. But the amount of shiitakes you get as that log ages throughout the years will start to diminish. And so what some producers will do is they will maybe mix up like different years of bolts. So in our demonstration yard, we have everything organized by year, just because we like to actually demonstrate and show people the differences. And it's a better way for us to keep track of what logs are productive or what logs aren't. But it can really help even out that flush or that shiitake production that you're getting if you are mixing up different aged logs. And so as I said, the fruiting will begin about a year after that inoculation happens, although it really only takes 6 months or so. And you can expect to begin seeing mushrooms or to begin creating mushrooms at like the very beginning of May. Once the temperatures are averaging around 70 degrees, usually when the season is getting going, a couple mushrooms will just start popping out of your logs. And for me, that's like a visual cue, like they're ready, we can start. And so you can really keep doing that until the end of September, or even with the past few seasons we've had, bolts can continue to fruit through October. And so as a grower, you can make a decision to force them to fruit or not. And so forcing them to fruit is submerging those logs in cold, clean water. So soaking them will trigger that perennial structure, that mycelium, to say like, whoa, like something's happening in my environment. It's cold and I'm getting a lot of moisture, and it triggers that fruiting to happen. Following the fruiting or following the soaking, you'll be able to harvest fruit within a week of that occurring. It really happens that fast. And so in order to get those triggers to go off, your bolt needs to be submerged in that cold, clean water for at least 12 hours, but more preferably is 24 hours, especially if it's your first soak of the year. You kind of want to get that moisture content back up and make sure those logs are really nice and hydrated. And I say clean water because, as we talked about before, mushrooms are made up of mostly water. So you want your water source to be clean so you can feel good about consuming them and not be worried that you have any type of contamination. So in my little home setup here with my helper, I actually just take a hose and I fill up my soaking containers, and then I repurpose that water to water the garden and put it back in the landscape. And it's just a system that works well for me. If you had a stream like we do here, I'll show you how we utilize that water in just a bit in a few different ways. And so you can also just see here that logs are pretty buoyant and they want to float. So I do put some cinder blocks on here to weight them down. And I've seen some pretty creative solutions for this. I've seen people make frames that are on hinges and actually come down and push their logs to submerge them in their fruiting containers. So you can do a number of different things to kind of keep the logs underwater. And so while I said 24 hours is preferable, you don't really want to go much longer than that. If those logs are underwater for 48 hours, like for about 2 days, they'll reach 100% moisture and the fungus will actually drown. So you'll be sitting there, you know, scratching your head, wondering why you're not getting this explosion of mushrooms within a week, like I said, and it's unfortunately because they might have died. So key moisture management is really important. And so I'm going to pop on another video here. This is what the process of inoculating looks like here in the Saisla Model Forest. And because of the social distancing measures, I am doing this process by myself in this video. But if we weren't concerned about proximity between people, we would maybe set up a little assembly line. So you can have someone that's like standing over in the stream, maybe someone in the middle, and then someone picking up the logs and handing it and passing it down. There's lots of opportunities for teamwork and assembly lines that make this process run much more smoothly. And so thinking about being a producer, especially if you are looking to manage maybe more than just a couple logs, you do want to look for efficiencies. So as you can see by this video, you know, picking up these logs and walking them across this landscape and then down into the hole and bending over and putting them in this little pool that I'll show you in a moment, it really isn't the most efficient. It works for us. We're excited to have the stream, but there is another way, and I'll show you right after this. We'll just get this playing. So this is what it looked like after I stepped over the bank. And we are not really proponents of modifying streams, but we were very lucky to have this natural pool form. And it's really quite fantastic. Oops, I think it's top there. It's really pretty fantastic that it forms. You can see up over here, it gets fed with fresh water, so it's always cold, it's nice and clean. And because of this little gravel bar that formed here, we don't lose our logs. We have put them in there before a rainfall event, and some have slipped over and washed downstream, but that's a different story. So this is quite convenient for us, but we understand that not everyone has a stream. So here's an example of us using a barrel. And what we've done in the past before that pool formed is we have taken a sump pump, like a gas-powered sump pump, so we don't need electricity, and we can just bring it down into the woods and run a hose with a filter on one end and submerge that in the stream, and have the other hose come from the pump and go into this barrel, and we can soak logs this way. So one is less labor, but you know, you can find pros and cons to everything. So with this method here, with the barrel or a soaking container, you are restricted to the amount of logs that can be soaked at one time. And so once your logs have gone through the spawn run and you're ready to start soaking, you can get on a little bit of a schedule. And this is another feature from that best management practices document that I showed you. And it's a little bit of a calendar that you could set up for yourself. So you can see here, starting in the beginning of May through the 3rd week of June, you have numbers 1 through 7. These numbers represent different stacks of shiitake bolts. So they're like different groups. You have 7 different groups. So you start the first group, the 1st week of May. They fruit, you lay them back down, and then 7 weeks later, at the end of June, you'll be ready to pick those bolts back up, submerge them again, and get them fruiting again. And then 7 weeks after that, the 3rd week of August, you can do the same thing. So you can actually see here, if you get started right away, for most of your stacks, you can actually get 3 fruitings in one season. Every 7 weeks apart. And so, as I said, once those logs are submerged and they're beginning to fruit, you can really expect to see mushrooms in about a week. It's really fun to check in on them and see how like these pins are forming. They're just little baby mushrooms coming out of those holes. Your first year, you might have to like wipe off some wax, but that'll go away after the first year and it does not need to be replaced. So here are a few different pictures of the stages of a shiitake mushroom maturing. At the far left here, you see my hand holding one. And what we're looking at here as these mushrooms develop is this lip or the edge of the shiitake mushroom. So this first picture here, and even the second one, are shiitakes at their total peak. When they still have that slight lip around the edge, that is when the mushrooms have like the best flavor and the longest shelf life. So it's really ideal to harvest at those times, just so you're not worrying about losing your mushrooms. And then as we move over here into the next few pictures, you can see it start to flatten out. And this last one here, we call a pancake. We don't want pancakes. Maybe for breakfast, but not for mushrooms. Oops. And then I'm just quickly going to show you a video of what it looks like to go through the process of harvesting. Here's a log that is beautifully fruiting. And I notice I'm using scissors. They're generally a lot safer than a knife. You usually risk cutting yourself a little less. And what I'm doing here is I'm taking each mushroom. I'm just going to pause it real quick. I'm taking each mushroom and I'm kind of feeling for that lip. I know already that pretty much all these are ready for harvest, but I'm still just kind of checking each one just out of habit. And what I was doing right there, I'll go back a little bit, is I'm noticing that there are some bugs. So you will see beetles, larval insects, pretty much anything and everything will start to colonize those mushrooms, especially the longer they're out there. So I'm just really tapping them off, and they do come right off. You can see closely they're crawling around there, and what I'm doing here is just blowing on them, and it causes them to really come right out of the gills. Now you only want to blow on them if it's for personal consumption, not if you're looking to sell them. Producers will use like compressed air and keep those out in the woods and give them a little blow. And so the name of the game is like getting to the mushrooms before everybody else. Insects, slugs, birds, rodents, deer, other competing fungus, you name it, it's going to start decomposing those decomposers. So you really want to have your mushrooms set up somewhere where you can keep an eye on them, watch that maturity occur, harvest them right when they're ready. And that is like your best bet for reducing pest pressure. Mushrooms that fruit first thing in the season don't really have a lot of bugs because they're not really out yet. And you can actually use a few tips and tricks to reduce the amount of slugs. I would say slugs are the biggest threat to your mushrooms. And so some producers will actually like break away leaf litter. We saw that picture a few slides ago of gravel down underneath where all the bolts are leaning to fruit. And all those things will just kind of reduce the habitat for pests, including slugs, and will reduce their ability to get to those mushrooms. And then here's an example of what happens when you don't get to your logs quick enough. They're totally infested. All of our pancakes here, I'm gonna blow on it real quick and they all just come pouring out. I unfortunately do not know the exact name. I'm not really an insect specialist of the beetle, but I can find out and report back if anyone's interested. But you can see the damage that's occurring here. There might have been a slug on that mushroom. There's a pretty big chunk taken out. And those gills are starting to brown. So I might use this for the soup pot, maybe not to actually eat. And then you get to eat mushrooms. That's like what you've all been waiting for. So the shiitakes are fruiting, you harvest them, you can put them in like a breathable paper bag in the fridge and they'll last for upwards of a week, or you can dry them. With this crazy warm and sunny and dry weather that we've had, I've been able to like fully dehydrate mushrooms out in the sun, which is usually not the case in the Northeast. You can lay them out like you see here in the picture in the sun, and they'll get pretty much all the way there, but you might have to finish them in a dehydrator or the oven. And just a quick note, all mushrooms should be cooked before eating them. A lot of mushrooms have like slight toxins that are broken down with heat. Otherwise, their cell walls are made of chitin, which is like what our fingernails are made of. So our digestive system cannot access those nutrients and all that goodness if you don't cook them. And so just to talk a little bit about like how many logs to do or how you want to scale your production, you can just have one log, or you could have hundreds or even thousands, but it's really up to you, and it's really up to meeting your needs. So if you think back to the beginning of the presentation about why you're growing mushrooms, that can really help you decide how many logs to grow. And we have a picture here of a large scale producer using a big pond, soaking tons at a time that will result in tens and tens of pounds of mushrooms. Or, you know, we have a soaking container down here with just a couple. So I would recommend just kind of getting your feet wet, both literally and figuratively, and do a couple and see how you like it. And then you can really increase as you'd like. There's been a lot of work in New York State around enterprise planning for shiitake growers. If you're interested in going that route, I would encourage you to follow up with me. I've got tons of guiding documents and enterprise sheets, and we can get those to you just to help you start thinking a little more formally about what it might look like to grow mushrooms on a larger scale for marketing. And they're a specialty crop. So you see shiitake mushrooms in the stores all the time. Those are usually grown inside, and they don't really have like the nutrients or the characteristics that these log grown mushrooms have. So shiitakes grown outside on logs are usually sold for $10 to $16 a pound, depending on like where you're located and if you want to be selling them in large amounts or just smaller amounts to individuals. And as I said, a lot of work was done in the state as part of a New York farm viability project. And in preparation for that project, it was found that if you manage and maintain a 1,000 log operation, your net income will be about $10,000 annually. Okay, and last slide. There are a few other mushrooms that can be pretty easily grown outside with similar techniques. So on the left here, we have a log that's laying down here with little wedges that are cut out. And so instead of drilling holes, we cut out wedges so we could grow oyster mushrooms. Oyster mushrooms can be grown by the hole drilling method, but this is a lot quicker and it's a lot less labor intensive with less materials. And these are fruiting quite nicely also down in our model forest. Over on the other side of the screen here, we have what's called a lion's mane mushroom. This mushroom is native to our woodlands, but it can be readily grown. And this is a slightly different method called a totem stack, where a log is cut to length, maybe about 1.5 feet, and what's called a cookie is cut off the top. You can pack spawn in that cookie, put another log on top. You can just like put a paper bag over it and it'll kind of paper mache. And that takes a little bit longer to produce, maybe about 2 years after you set that all up, you'll start getting some really nice fruitings. And then the mushroom in the middle here is our stropharia, wine cap stropharia. This is another one that does grow wild here, and it's a favorite for gardens. This mushroom likes to be grown on the ground in contact with the dirt and with like wood chips or straw. And it's a really easy, nice beginner mushroom. And so the links that we'll be sharing have more guidance on how to produce all of these. You might find, like myself, it's kind of contagious to grow mushrooms. So just quickly to highlight some of those resources we've been talking about. We will be housing some of these documents on our website, which is right here. Another great resource is a website called My Woodlot that is created and managed by our partners at the Watershed Agricultural Council. And they have a great page on farming your woods and some really nice documents put together on shiitake production. And then Cornell Small Farms manages a page as well that houses like that buying and selling document and a ton of great fact sheets on not only shiitakes, but all those other mushrooms we talked about. And then this last link here is for that document I keep referring to. I misspelled log. Best management practices for log grown shiitake cultivation. If you just search that, it'll come right up. Otherwise, you can follow this link. We can send all those out to you, maybe as a reward after we get your evaluations back. And so that's it. Thank you so much for joining. Luckily, we do have about 10 minutes left. I didn't eat up all of the time, and we can talk about some questions. If you want to follow up with me, I put my email here. And I also just created or added a link to our website. We did want to make this presentation free for anyone who wants to join, but if you do feel so inclined, you are able to donate to our organization by following this link. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and we can go back in and talk about some questions that have come up.
Tracey, I have a couple written down unless you want to use the chat instead.
Go right ahead with the ones you have written down.
So the first one is, what's the minimum size or amount of wood to use for a bolt?
So like I said, that 3-inch diameter is your total minimum. If you go any smaller than that, it's going to be really hard to maintain moisture. And something I didn't talk too much about is maintenance soaks. So if you do want to work with smaller logs, or if you feel like maybe you had some sunlight, or if it's really windy, you can do maintenance soaks. So you can submerge those bolts for about 5 or maybe 6 hours, and that will kind of get them back up to moisture content. And for the length, we have done mini bolts, but they really don't perform well. So that like maybe 2.5 or 3 foot is your minimum length. Oops, someone's looking for my email. I'm just going to put it in the chat.
Yeah, I did that as well.
Okay.
I added both of our emails recently. If there's anything you need on this presentation, any of these topics or anything else that we might cover, you can email us at any time.
And I'll include all this information in the follow-up email with the evaluation as well.
Thank you, Devin.
So Tracey, there are a couple other great ones that I wanted to note, and one is, at what stage does the fruit release spores?
So as that cap's opening, once that lip goes away, that's when it really produces spores. I actually brought some slightly flattened shiitakes into my house, and I could see these clouds of spores coming up. And so, as I said, the shiitakes are not native to our area, so even though those spores are being produced and going out into the world, they will not be able to grow anywhere, unfortunately.
So we had a quick follow-up on the bolt size and a question about why those shorter bolts don't perform well, and do you think frequent maintenance soaks would help maintain that?
I do, yeah. You know, not a lot of research or work has been done on those shorter bolt sizes. So if you want to just have one and you want it to be short, or maybe just a handful, you can really keep an eye on them and do those maintenance soaks even through that first year, that spawn run. Maybe about a month or so after you do your inoculation, give them a dunk. Some people will put sprinklers on them, and I haven't seen any research that actually helps. I think it feels good for the grower. It feels like you're doing something for your logs, but I would recommend actually just submerging them in water.
And another one is, what is the effect of productivity if you don't harvest as you know at each fruiting?
It won't change anything at all. Whether or not you harvest your mushrooms, whether or not you force them to fruit, that lifespan of your bolt is still that same amount of time, because that perennial structure living in that log is consuming all of the food at the exact same rate. So if you just choose to let your logs sit there and you're not really forcing them to fruit, you might think that you're extending their life, but they're still going to start tapering out after that 4-year period.
Tracey, I wasn't sure if you just saw the few that are coming in.
I haven't really read them. Let's see.
One is
I see that one that just came in about letting the first flush come naturally. I am a big fan of that. If I know that I have provided the right conditions for my bolts, I wait for them to pop. And that to me says like they're ready to grow. They're ready to start that management. So I think that's a great technique that you can just keep an eye on them. And when you see them popping, then you can start your soaking. Let's see what other ones.
do you have any, one here is, have you personally experienced other mushrooms log grown or other ways to grow mushrooms such as in buckets? I think it's, I assume it's asking about, John's asking about different techniques to produce and maybe your success or experimentation on those.
Yeah, you know, when I started growing mushrooms, I began indoors, and you just have to create all of those needs, those requirements, those environmental conditions yourself. So it does take a lot of energy and time. And I would direct you to Cornell Small Farms. They have actually shifted quite a bit due to interest from outdoor growth to indoor operations, especially in urban areas. So they have a lot of groundwork laid, a lot of resources for how to grow inside. I would recommend starting with oyster mushrooms. They grow on cellulose, anything and everything, and they're super competitive. So you'll find success with those if you want to get started with some indoor production. But I can't say I'm an expert in that field.
Tracy, there was another quick follow-up on the fruiting productivity, and is there any effect on the next fruiting within the same season if you don't harvest, or does your overview of having no impact still apply to that?
It still applies. Yeah, I think people have kind of like racked their brains about how to maybe extend the life or extend the productivity of a log, and it is what it is. It's going to give you about, on average, that 1/4 to 1/2 pound per fruiting, and it'll be more in the beginning, whether you harvest them or not, and it'll be less in those subsequent years, maybe year 3 or 4, whether or not you harvest them. And so I'll just share a little trick. As I recommended, it's nice to mix up your ages. So to have like 3-year-old bolts mixed with 1-year-old bolts, so you're getting like a consistent amount per fruiting. And it can be hard to keep track of what logs have aged out when you're doing that. So I like to do like a 3 strikes and you're out kind of rule. If you do a soaking and you lean your logs up and one doesn't produce any mushrooms, I tie a piece of tree tape on that log, and maybe I just like chalk it up to a bad day for that log, and I put it back and continue to manage it. And then 7 weeks later, when I soak again, if I see no mushrooms on that same log with a piece of tree tape on it, I put another piece of tree tape on the other end. So that's the 2 strikes, put it back in the pile, and then if that occurs a 3rd time, I remove it from production. And when I remove logs from production, I put them in my little Shiitake bolt graveyard. It's just all the bolts laid out on the forest floor, connected with the ground, and those will just spontaneously fruit, sometimes for as long as 10 years. we have seen logs keep on keeping on.
And Tracey, I think I've only seen one more come in, and question was, the local area has had a history of growing mushrooms. I think horse manure was what was meant, and oh yeah, there's the clarify. Is that still a viable way to grow mushrooms, using horse manure?
Yeah, totally. So there's like a lot of interesting caves and geological features in this region. And this area has been really, really successful at growing mushrooms in kind of those like dark, dank, moist caves or geological areas for years. And there's a family that they've been doing it for generations, and they still use, I believe, a number of different substrates or materials to grow the mushrooms on. And like manure and more heavy substrates like compost and soil are what's used to grow those like button mushrooms that you get from the supermarkets. And a lot of those come out of Pennsylvania, which is like the mushroom capital of the country. So yeah, that's still very much a viable technique. Again, that would be kind of stepping more into like the indoor growing as opposed to growing out in the woods. Okay. Well, gosh, I thought we would finish early, but I guess I had a lot to say about mushrooms. I could go on. So if those are all of the questions, I would encourage you to stay in touch. You'll be getting those evaluations from Devin, and we can follow up with a more detailed list of resources that I've referenced. And please, at any time, feel free to shoot me an email, give me a call. I'll be back in the office soon, and I'd love to help anybody out if I can. And I guess happy mushrooming. I wish you were all here with me, and I'll let you all know if we're able to schedule a workshop sometime in the near future.
Oh, and Tracey, if for anyone else still listening, if you do have any follow-up questions that we might have missed or you think of after, please feel free to reach out to me or Tracey, and I'll make sure that Tracey gets them no matter who you contact with CCE Columbia Green.
Absolutely. Great. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. It was great talking shiitakes with all of you.
All right. Honor, do you need to save your chat before we close the meeting?
I already did.
Already did.
Excellent.
All right. Perfect. All right. Then let's end it up. All right. Thank you, Tracey.
Thanks, Tracey.
Right. Thank you.